Hello, welcome to Red Red. Today I wanted to quickly talk about Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, which is probably kind of like how, if you've read anything of Thomas Pynchon, you've probably read The Crying of Lot 49 because of how short it is. This is one of those things where if you know, this is probably the thing of Rilke's that most people have read because it is very short. It's just 10 letters that were, so what this book contains is basically the letters that a young poet, Franz Capus, received from Rilke in response to letters that he was writing, and we don't get the letters that he wrote, even though we do get a sonnet of his that he wrote because Rilke wrote it, put it back in the letter, which was nice. And they were, but the 10 letters, they were between 1903 and 1908, and yeah, so like a lot of people would have read this or would have at least read parts of it. And what I just wanted to talk about was that there are some ideas in here that you will read and you will be like, oh, I can see where the romantic model for living an artistic life, a poetic life, comes from. But then there are some other things in here which I think are maybe glossed over that are also really, really touching. But there's not a whole lot of context to give. Basically, the setup is just that this guy, this poet, was sending letters to Rilke, and some of the things, first he's asking him questions about craft and verse and whatnot. Later on, they've developed a sort of correspondence. Capus seems to imply from Rilke's response that Capus is dealing with losing faith in God, and also there is a very long section where Capus is obviously grieving the death of somebody, maybe likely a family member, and Rilke spends a lot of time dealing with that. There are a lot of sort of quotables, and I can very easily imagine that you will have seen, that you'll have come across like quotes from Rilke on like motivational posters and stuff, but I'm just going to dig through. I found that there were times when I still sort of highlighted the one-liners, the epigraphs, but there were some whole sections that I really wanted to read and highlight. Not whole letters, but just whole paragraphs. But I'll skip through, I'll read some of the letters and sort of read some of the extracts and talk about them. So starting off, one of the first things that we get in the letter to a young poet is Rilke talking about not worrying so much about critical attention. And of course, it's probably important the whole way through, but I think he's really stressing that it's important for young writers and poets to not worry about it. And he says, there is nothing less apt to touch a work of art than critical words. All we end up with there is more or less felicitous misunderstandings. And so he goes on, and it's because of the start he starts to cultivate and starts to talk about cultivating kind of poetry within yourself and going out and learning a lot of important things. And again, another really big one, another big quotable. Ask yourself in your night's quietest hour, must I write? And if it should be affirmative, if it is given to you to respond to this serious question with a loud and simple I must, then construct your life according to this necessity. Your life, right into its most inconsequential and slightest hour, must become a sign and witness of this urge. So yeah, obviously it's sort of like ask yourself, must you write? But about sort of cultivating your entire daily routine as well so that you can write. And recently I've been learning about Zadie Smith and Carlo Knausgaard and talking about their how they've had to change their writing process based on growing up and having family. And Zadie Smith is really staunch in the fact that rituals and setups and whatnot are kind of for young people, and now she just writes when she can. Like once the kids are in school, she'll go to the library and write. And I think that's a very it's a more modern example of this sort of constructing your life such that it is all that you do. And Rilke's maybe saying this to an earlier person, but also balancing it with the practicalities of you need to work, and so on and so forth. Brandon Sanderson, of course, talks about these practicalities in his lectures. He talks about even if you're working a full-time job, if all you do is write for 4 hours on Saturday, then by the end of the year you should have a draft of a novel, which is a long time to have a draft of a novel if all you're writing is 4 hours a week, but you will have it by the end, and it's better than nothing. It's better than not starting. So yeah. And talking more specifically maybe about searching into your memories and searching deep within yourself to find the inner poet, Rilke says, "For he who creates must be a world of his own and find everything within himself and in the natural world that he has elected to follow," which is making me so excited again to go and read Proust's In Search of Lost Time. I did say that I wanted to read the Western Core series. You might have noticed the attentive that this pile has shifted. I'm actually reading them in reverse order right now. So the next book on the Western Core series is Proust's In Search of Lost Time, and I know I love it. It might get into the Ulysses territory of being so much for me that I don't know if I can make a video about it, but I digress. In the second letter, written on the 5th of April in 1903, Rilke talks about something which really harkens forward to something David Foster Wallace talks about, and he talks about irony. Irony, don't let yourself be ruled by it, especially not in uncreative moments. In creative ones, try to make use of it as one means among many to get a grasp on life. Used purely, it too is pure, and there is no need to be ashamed of it. And if you feel too familiar with it, if you fear your intimacy is growing too much, then turn towards great and serious subjects, next to which irony becomes small and helpless. And David Foster Wallace went on a lot about irony, especially in his essay E Unibus Plurum, and talking about television becoming sort of self-aware and dealing with that. Nice to sort of read that and read where it's coming from, I guess 80 years prior. And again, this is maybe not something I entirely agree with, or not a lot of people agree with, but you can see how it's contributing to Rilke's kind of pure cultivating a poetic mind frame. He says, "Read as little as possible in the way of aesthetics and criticism. It will either be partisan views fossilized and made meaningless in its lifeless rigidity, or it will be neat wordplay where one opinion will triumph one day and the opposite the next. Works of art are infinitely solitary, and nothing is less likely to reach them than criticism. Only love can grasp them and hold them and do them justice." And to convert that into a modern day thing, yes, you can talk and kind of correspond with people and artists who are close to you, but Zadie Smith talks about like going on the internet is for an artist and seeing 50,000 people respond to you all at once being the equivalent of just like doing self-harm. It's kind of absurd, and it's really toxic and damaging. This one is maybe a bit cheesy, but here we go. But difficult things are what we were set to do. Almost everything serious is difficult, and everything is serious. I talked a bit about this in the notebooks of Multilord Brigger. In that video, I pronounced it Brig, which I didn't realize is incorrect, but I'm sure I've done that many times in the past. Rilke's perspective on is pretty progressive and forward-thinking perspectives on women, probably kind of helped by the environment in which he grew up. He talks about it in here as well. Perhaps a great maternity lies over everything as a shared longing, the beauty of the virgin of a being who, as you put it so well, has not yet achieved anything, is maternity divining and preparing itself, anxious and full of longing. And the beauty of a mother is maternity at work, and that of the old woman a great memory. And in the man too there is maternity, as it seems to me, physical and spiritual. His engendering is also a kind of giving birth, and it is the act of birth when he creates out of his inmost resources. And perhaps the sexes are more closely related than we think, and the great renewal of the world will perhaps consist in man and woman freed of all sense and error and disappointment, seeking one another out, not as opposites, but as brothers and sisters and neighbors, and they will join together as human beings to share the heavy weight of sexuality that is laid upon them with simplicity, gravity, and patience. And so you can obviously see how forward-thinking and that is, considering that letter was written on the 16th of July, 1903. I realized I've actually right now, because I'm going full Rilke fanboy, I'm reading through the collected poems, the poetry of Rilke, and that's a nice, wholesome perspective on it. And I'm not going to read, well, I'm not going to do a video on this book because I'm not just going to read poetry to you. That's, not going to happen. But as a different thing, I want to read a poem that is Rilke writing A Woman's Fate. The poem is entitled A Woman's Fate. And he writes, just as the king out on a hunt picks up a glass to drink from, anyone at all, and afterward its owner puts it away and guards it like some fabled chalice, so perhaps fate, who also thirsts, at times raised a woman to its lips and drank, whom then a small life, too much afraid of breaking her, locked away from use, inside the tremulous glass cabinet in which its most precious things are kept, at least the things considered precious. There she stood strange, like something loaned, and became merely old, and became blind, and was not precious, and was never special. So the same perspective, but coming at it from a much darker and much like, ugh. He talks about the dangers of flinging yourself into a relationship before you have cultivated a really strong internal solitude and an ability to explore your own inner workings. And he says, but how can people who have already flung together and no longer set themselves any limits or tell one another apart, and who therefore possess nothing of their own anymore, how on earth can they find a way out of themselves, out of the depths of a solitude that has already been split and squandered? And another big one, I think this is the chapter where he's, or the letter where he's responding to Kappa's talking about being in mourning. He says, I can say almost nothing that is of any help, hardly anything useful. You have had many great sadnesses which have now passed by, and you say that their passing was also hard and upsetting for you. But I ask you to consider whether these great unhappinesses did not rather pass through you, whether much within you has not changed, whether somewhere in some part of your being you were not transformed while you were unhappy. And something that Rilke does talk about is how a lot of the changes and a lot of the things that make us up are like subconscious, and they get into us, into our heart, long before we realize that they're happening. And the only reason we're ever surprised at these things is because we're not focusing on the things coming into us. Again, easy to see how it gets into a pop psychology thing, but it is nice to read it in such an isolated context. And the very last thing that he talks about, which I find, was really lovely to read, was his idea that God is actually has not even been born yet, and that every great, true, pure thing that we do as artists is actually contributing to the birth of God. It's a really lovely idea. But yeah, that's all I really wanted to talk about with Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. As you can imagine, it's a very easy read. You pick this up and you just smash it out in like an hour, but you can go back, you can constantly reread, take notes of particular sections that you liked, and let me know what you thought of the Letters to a Young Poet. I know it's not exactly a very deep or like quantifiable work, but it is very nice, and it's just a kind of like pick you up for if you're trying to be an artist and you just need some kind of romantic inspiration. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you consider giving this a read or a reread, and I'll see you in the next video.